I'm in the New Forest, and we don't always have the greatest bandwidth here. So if I disappear, give me a couple of minutes, and worst case is I've got Mike's phone number, and we'll sort it out. But let's hope we don't have any technicals. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about climate change, particularly its impacts on new forest habitats and in the New Forest. If I lean that way, you can just see there's a New Forest pony behind me, and as Mike mentioned. See, I am Director of Wild New Forest. We are a small specialist ecological consultancy doing work within the New Forest National Park, and most of my time these days is spent working on private land around the fringe of the forest, undertaking ecological surveys and advising landowners on measures to improve biodiversity on their land. So at the minute, I'm probably working across a few thousand acres of the New Forest. So there's our website. And I'm also chair of the Biodiversity Forum. If you're interested in the New Forest, if you're interested in the wild and other aspects, then if you go to the New Forest Biodiversity Hub, again, the link is there. That's the homepage for the forum. And we have a monthly newsletter that has a wildlife roundup, conservation roundup for the New Forest, and information about all our projects and funding opportunities. So this piece of work that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to give an introduction to the piece of work. I'm going to put it into context by talking about some of the global drivers of biodiversity change. Most of you will be familiar with those, and a short introduction to the New Forest. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the New Forest. And then really the meat of the talk is going to look at recent climate change in the New Forest going back over the last 3 or 4 decades, what impact those changes have had on New Forest habitats and species, and then some aspects around what we can do about it. So a few months ago, I was commissioned by the New Forest National Park Authority to deliver a series of educational materials and workshops relating to climate change impacts on the New Forest, with the aim of improving climate literacy, particularly for youngsters. This slide deck is one of the deliverables, and the project also will be having workshops and such like with members of the New Forest Youth Climate and Nature Scheme and others. So you're really the guinea pigs. You're the first group that's been shown the slides. So it'd be really good to get questions and feedback afterwards. And certainly the New Forest National Park Authority, if you go on their website, they've got quite a lot about the role of the New Forest in terms of climate change, acting as a carbon store, how we can reduce our impact on the New Forest. And they say quite unequivocally, in their view, climate change is the biggest long-term threat to the New Forest National Park. And I'll talk a bit about some of the reasons why in a bit. So globally, there was a big piece of work done about 5 years ago. That was the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Massive assessment. You can see there 145 authors from 50 countries. Took them 3 years. Another 300 or so contributors and 15,000 sources of data. And they came up with a list that, to be honest, most of you will be familiar with this in terms of what are the big drivers of biodiversity change. So changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation of organisms through forestry, fishing, farming. Climate change comes in at number 3, pollution number 4, and invasive alien species at number 5. But interestingly, there was a piece of work published last year that also was under the IPBES banner, that said basically our results suggest that climate change might become a more important driver of biodiversity loss than land use change by the mid-century, i.e. 2050. That's only 2 or 3 decades away. So globally, they're saying a similar thing to the New Forest National Park Authority, that in the coming decades, climate change is probably going to be the biggest threat to biodiversity globally and in our area. So the New Forest covers about 560 square kilometres, and the core of it, the open forest, which many people will be most familiar with, covers about half of that area, and that's protected under various nature conservation designations, and it's primarily managed by Forestry England. And it's estimated that about 20,000 species of animal, plant and fungus occur in the New Forest. That's about 1/3 of the UK total. So arguably, it's one of the most biodiverse landscapes in the UK and indeed in lowland Western Europe. And through the forum, we're in the process of commissioning a biodiversity audit for the New Forest that will really pin down these figures a bit more accurately. And as we all know, the landscape of the open forest is shaped by the grazing currently of around up to 10,000 roaming livestock. ponies, cattle, donkey, sheep, and seasonally pigs, and 5 species of deer, which might make another 5 to 10,000 animals within the park. And the livestock grazing is underpinned by a commoning and farming community that's really important as a strong history in the New Forest as well. In more recent decades, it's become a popular tourist destination. We've got over 15 million recreational day visits per annum. Now, I would argue that the 5 main global drivers of biodiversity change that I mentioned in the previous slide are all relevant to the New Forest, but things like forest management, including stock numbers and recreational activity, are particularly pertinent drivers of local importance in terms of the biodiversity and our impacts on it. And I like this quote from the late, great Colin Tubbs from his seminal book, The New Forest, which was published about 25 years ago, that talks about really the fact that the unenclosed lands of the New Forest are pretty unique now in lowland Britain, and with big tracts of habitats that are quite rare now at a lowland Western European scale, particularly the heathland, valley mire, and pasture woodland, and that nowhere else do these habitats occur on such a large scale and so interconnected. You know, the ability to walk from Lymington to Bramshaw in a day and cross all those different habitats is certainly unique in a lowland England context. And then one of the modern greats, Clive Chatters, who's just published The Nature of the New Forest. If you haven't got it, I strongly recommend you get a copy and read it. Yeah, his comment is that there's nothing intrinsically special about the New Forest other than it has survived into the modern age. The wildlife of the forest, which we regard as special, was once commonplace, but today's forest is a reminder of the potential of lowland landscapes to support extraordinary habitats and species. So when you look at the latest land cover map, that's actually shown in the latest DEFRA land use consultation that was released a few days ago. When you look at the New Forest, those purples and dark greens really stand out compared to the rest of lowland England as being a significant block of particularly woodland and heathland. So in terms of the recent climate change impacts, those of you that are familiar with the Show Your Stripes motto, which originated from Ed Hawkins at University of Reading, this is actually the stripes for Southampton, and I'll show another Southampton plot in a moment. But to put things into context in terms of recent global climate change, this is a nice quote from Attenborough. You know, right now we're facing a man-made disaster of global scale, our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change, arguably the greatest threat to humans since the last glacial period. And when we look at some of the figures, this is just recent stuff that's come out of the news. This is on BBC News. You can get similar plots from many organisations. This shows that we're now about 1.6 degrees above the pre-industrial average temperature. And remember that we're aiming to keep below 1.5. So this is only a year, but it's likely that this is going to be sustained and that we have breached that 1.5 degree limit already. So big rise in temperature, particularly since about 1980 globally. And it's ongoing. So the latest data that came in for last month, January 2025, showed that it was the hottest January in modern history. And that's primarily been driven by increases in greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere through burning of fossil fuels. So if you look at carbon dioxide, if you look back nearly 1 million years, you can see the hockey stick, the big spike associated with the pre-industrial era. And we're entering concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere that we haven't had for a very long time. So to be honest, it's no surprise really that the planet is responding in the way that it is. And obviously there's a big policy and political challenge in terms of how we deal with that. But at the minute, we're not really dealing with it. And so as a consequence, under current policies, by the end of the century, with the latest projections, we're looking at 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming, whereas the aim really was to try and stay below 1.5 degrees. And every day you read the news, it looks like we're moving further and further away. So if we focus on local climate change in the New Forest, I took this quote from Barack Obama because although it's got global scope, it's very relevant to here. He says, climate change is no longer some far off problem. It is happening here and it is happening now. So within the New Forest National Park, the average temperatures have risen by about 0.5 degree to 1 degree over the past 4 decades and are projected to increase under all future emission scenarios. And alongside those increased temperatures, the latest Met Office projections show an overall trend for hotter, drier summers and warmer, wetter winters. And I'll provide a bit more detail on that in a minute. However, I think as we're all aware, natural variability is such that, despite these overall trends, we can still expect some pretty dismal wet summers and also some dry, cold winters in the coming years and decades. Other trends that are less certain, but I'm sure will firm up in due course, so for more intense summer rainfall events, because there's more heat in the atmosphere, it can hold more water. Increased frequency of hot summer days, i.e. those above 30 degrees. A fall in the number of frost days and also an increase in the number of growing days, and a continued acceleration in sea level rise. So we're also doing a piece of work for the National Park where we're looking at state-of-the-art climate projections based on Met Office data specifically for the New Forest. So these aren't averaged across regional or national scales. These are just focusing on the grid cells that cover the New Forest. And this table has it all in. And a couple of things that I want to pick out. So this really looks at 4 decades of data, and then it projects forward up to 2100. And the numbers in black are the ones that are the intermediate emissions pathway. You could argue that at the moment we're heading for the high emission scenario, but both the low and the high emission scenarios, the figures are in grey. And just to pick out a few things, so the annual average temperature specifically for the New Forest over the last 4 decades or so has gone up about 0.7 degrees. But by 2100, it's projected to go up about 3 degrees. That's the annual average temperature. But you'll see that other red box under the temperatures, the summer average is due to go up by nearly 4.5 degrees. But the range is anything from 2.5 to over 7 degrees, depending on which emissions pathway we eventually follow. So you can imagine summer average temperatures at the minute of around 16. You add 7 degrees to that, and it goes up to about 23 degrees as the average temperature. That's going to have huge implications for our biodiversity. So the temperature is increasing across all seasons. And then if we look at rainfall, the annual average actually is very spiky. It's got very high variability. It hasn't changed much over the last few decades, a slight increase. And it's not projected to change much if you just look at the annual average. But interestingly, if you look at the summer average, it's due to decrease by 43% by the end of the century, which is massive. And the winter average is due to increase by about 20%. Interestingly, if you look at the summer average over the last 4 decades or so, it's actually gone up. So that's contrary to what the long-term predictions are telling us, that it's going to get drier, there's going to be more drought. Well, actually, over the last 4 decades or so, we've got more average rainfall in summer than we had before. So again, that just shows some of the uncertainties. These are projections, and they're going to keep changing every year as we get more and more data coming in. I've pulled this one out of the Show Your Stripes website, and I encourage you to have a look at it because you can pull out data from any parts of England or globally. But this is the temperature change in Southampton relative to an average that goes back about 50 years from 1960 to 2010. And the reason I've pulled this out is it shows a marked shift in temperature around the early 1990s. And this coincides with what was called a regime shift in the Northeast Atlantic around that period in the early to mid 1990s. And I think this has had a really important impact on our biodiversity, as I'll talk about later. But just have a think about that. So the anomaly went from largely negative, and then from about the early 1990s onwards, it's been almost wholly positive. So that means temperatures overall have been above the long-term average in that period, and we've had very few sort of cold years or cold winters in that period. So these things are all having a big impact on the New Forest. So when we look at impacts on habitats, what I'm going to do in these next few sections is it's impossible to be comprehensive in a talk like this or in a slide deck like this without going into hundreds of slides. So I'm just going to pull out a few sort of topical examples to illustrate some of the different impacts that the climate change is having. So this is Hurst Spit. Anyone that's walked along Hurst Spit in winter will know that it can look pretty raggedy and fragile at times. And for my sins, I've been out at the castle in a storm trying to find leeches, petrels, and other wind-driven seabirds and been out there when the neck of the spit has been breached, and effectively we're on a little island, which is both fun and quite scary at the same time. So if you focus on those coastal habitats first, there's a lot of work going on in this space. If you hadn't heard of it, there's a Hurstspit to Lymington strategy that's led by the Environment Agency with other government partners and consultants. And that's really looking at the stretch between Hurstspit and Lymington and what's going to happen to it over the next 100 years. And they're looking at impacts from climate change, such as rising sea levels, heavier rainfall and flooding, and how that's going to impact the coast, the rivers, the wildlife, and the people. But the bottom line is, in their words, it's not possible to keep maintaining the coastline as it is now. So what the strategy is doing is looking at how, as a community, we can best adapt to the challenges, but do it on a looking at the next 100-year type timescale. So for the strategy, they have some pathways that they've put out into the public domain, and already there's been various positive and negative responses to those in the media. There'll be a formal public consultation next summer, but then once the strategy is approved, they're hoping to start developing the projects from spring 2027. So that's a couple of years from now. And if they can get the money, which is a big question, construction for some aspects of the scheme will begin in the next within the next decade. So I've put a link to the website, but if you're interested, have a look at it. Just to pull out a couple of examples from a couple of the management units. I think there's 7 or 8 management units altogether. The Hurstspit itself is one where they're going to eventually let natural processes become more dominant, which has raised significant alarm amongst local communities. I'm going to focus on 2 areas here. One is the Keyhaven management unit that's outlined in the yellow in the top left of the slide, this area in here. And for that one, they're looking at a managed realignment with salt marsh creation. So this is quite drastic, but their view is this will be one of the first. So the existing seawall comes along here, west of Keyhaven, between Keyhaven and Hurstspit. And they're basically going to let this area go and have a new seawall that comes around something like this. So that's a pretty significant change. You won't be able to walk along this bit of seawall in the next 20 years, 20, 30 years, I suspect, if this all comes to pass. However, if you go to the other end of the area of interest and you look at the Normandy Lagoon and the Normandy area to the south of Lymington town, they've recognised, encouragingly, that due to the high conservation value of Normandy Lagoon itself, then they're going to maintain the defences around the area, and there's going to be some realignment of the area immediately south of the Yacht Haven. But basically, this area is primarily going to be hold the line, in part because you've got Lymington there as a hard stop, but in part because of the high conservation value of Normandy Lagoon. So, and there's lots of other complexities in between, like old rubbish tips and some fairly high value property inboard of the existing seawall in between those 2 areas, between Keyhaven and Lymington. So a lot happening at the coast, and there's a lot happening in our woodlands. So in early 2020, we had 3 named storms and we lost hundreds, if not thousands, of trees, particularly beech trees. They don't do very well in winter when there's waterlogging of the soil, particularly on the clay. They're very shallow rooted, as you can see from this image here. And as a consequence, they're very prone to wind throw when you get severe storms coinciding with those waterlogged clay soils. Another thing that we're finding is that a lot of the older beech are suffering from what we call beech snap, where because of internal rot, because of in some cases a combination of fungi and insects, eventually the rot becomes sufficient that the tree just collapses anything from 1 to 5 meters above the base, and it can happen at any time. They call these trees the widow makers, and I spend a large proportion of my summer and autumn under beech trees looking for invertebrates and fungi. So my chances of getting tonked by one of these collapsing are probably higher than average. But so this isn't related to wind primarily. This is just internal rot, which happens over a long period, and then eventually the tree collapses. One of the things that happened in the big drought of 2022 was that a lot of the beech trees were under significant stress and they actually shed their leaves. So this photo was taken in my local bit of ancient woodland, which is Busketts Wood, on the 22nd of August. And I was walking across a bed of freshly fallen beech leaves, which was quite unnerving. And you could almost, if you're out in the forest a lot, you can sort of sense what's happening, and you could feel that the forest was under real stress. It was around that period we were getting temperatures up to 40 degrees, and beech and many other species just don't operate well in those conditions. And it's well documented that beech across all of Europe suffered horribly in the 1976 drought, and that growth was retarded in many beech trees after that, if not, the trees completely died. So they do suffer from drought, and some of them never fully recover, and are much more prone to then being attacked by fungi and insects and other things. Encouragingly, the oaks seem to be holding up, and they seem to be coping with the wet winters and the dry summers and the droughts much better than the beech trees. And this is a couple of colleagues, Steve Laycock and Neil Bocock, who did some nice work last year, which I'll mention in a minute, going out and measuring the oldest and biggest oak and beech trees in the forest to see how they were holding up. So this followed on from work by Chris Reed that was published in 1999. And he went out and measured all of the biggest ancient oak and beech trees in the New Forest and documented them. And I've put a reference and a link in there. But that was a really great resource because there were 10-figure grid references. You could go back and revisit the trees that he'd measured. And he noted that the droughts, 1976, etc., and the great storms of 1987 and 1990 had really taken their toll on beech trees. And this was 25 years ago. And Colin Tubbs, in his 2001 book, also mentioned how beech is under stress because of the changing climate. So when Steve and Neil did their work, they found of the total of 24 beeches recorded by Chris Reed that they could remeasure, and 21 were fallen or dead, and a further 2 partially collapsed. So that's a failure rate of 65% in 25 years. And apologies, that should be 34 beeches that they measured, and 21 were fallen or dead, and 2 partially collapsed. So that failure rate of 65% in 25 years is pretty significant. And it's not dissimilar between Chris Reed and his predecessors' work as well. So we're losing about 2/3 of our oldest beech trees every couple of decades, something like that. And so that's a pretty high failure rate. The extent to which climate change is responsible is questionable. It could just be a particular age cohort that's starting to fall over. But what you do see, so Adrian Newton at Bournemouth University, I was interviewed for BBC a few years ago for BBC South Today, and he made this comment where you start to see a situation where the whole ecosystem starts to collapse, and what was an ancient, wonderfully rich beech forest now becomes different, becomes a grassland in some places, and that has big impacts on the species that are beech dependent, either wholly or partially. And if you go to areas like Denny Wood, and you see the cathedral beeches and the canopy collapse there, and Markash Wood, and you just spend any time walking around a bit of ancient beech woodland, you can see it. It's really under a lot of stress at the minute. And Forest Research, which is a research branch of Forestry Commission and Forestry England, their view is that in southern England, beech probably isn't going to be a viable forestry species from about 2050, 2070 onwards, because it's just going to be outside of its climate envelope. In terms of heathland habitats, I've just picked out this case study around controlled burning, which in itself is a controversial topic. People see burning on the New Forest and think, why are we burning? Why are we burning the peat? Because they might not have an understanding of how controlled burning works. But I thought this stat was really interesting. So this was Dave Morris, DM, Forestry England, commenting for the Open Forest Advisory Committee meetings last spring. And he reported that in the preceding winter, they only managed to do 13 hectares of prescribed burning against a programme that was trying to achieve 276 hectares. So they only did just under 5% of what they were aiming to do. And that was because we had the wettest winter, winter on record. And it meant that they weren't able to go out and do that burning because it was just constantly saturated. The ground was saturated, the vegetation was saturated. And their concern at that time was if we had another wet winter, i.e. this winter, then it'd really start to impact the delivery of their control burning programme. And that control burning underpins a lot of the heathland management. That means that we've got species like woodlark and Dartford warbler and all those amazing lichens and flora that rely upon that open sort of managed, recently burnt and recently cut area. So it's going to have a real impact if we keep getting these wet winters on just forest management as well as the actual biodiversity. If we look at wetland and riverine habitats, In spring 2020, during lockdown, we were fortunate enough to have a contract with Forestry England going out and doing breeding wader work, and it was an exceptionally dry spring. So the Valley Mires, which on the left at the start of the survey in sort of March, April, looked pretty vibrant and wet. By the time we got to the end of the survey in June, this one on the right is Moon Hills in the southeast of the New Forest, and it was completely desiccated and parched by June. That valley in March and April had waders such as snipe, redshank, lapwing, and curlew all feeding and or breeding within it. And I think it's self-evident that by June, there were no waders in that habitat. It was too dry, too parched, and even if they were able to get food, the fact that predators could just go wandering all the way through that with no hindrance would mean that their breeding success was likely to be even lower than normal. So these dry summers are having an impact on our wetlands. And another perhaps less obvious impact is where wetland restoration is happening. Generally, it's being done to improve climate resilience and to restore biodiversity and natural processes, and that's all positive and fantastic. And here's one example where this is Longwater Lawn near Lyndhurst, where a stream restoration was done about 15 years ago. It's one of the first ones. You can see nice features here. So you've got cut off meanders and cut banks and such like. That very, very wet first quarter of 2020, just 5 weeks before this photo was taken in February, mid-February 2020, this is what it looked like. So because of the stream restoration, the stream is much more, this is the Beauly River, the Upper Beauly River. The river is actually much better connected to the floodplain. And so when it rains heavily and the ground's saturated, it does what it should do, is it floods. And water therefore covers the floodplain. It provides nutrients to that floodplain, and it's a restoration of natural processes. So you might think, well, that's all positive, that's really good. But one of the challenges is that anyone that follows the news will probably be aware of combined sewer overflow discharges from wastewater treatment works, which is a national issue, but is one that's very pertinent here in the New Forest. And the Lyndhurst wastewater treatment works occur just 1.5 kilometres upstream of this location. And whenever it rains moderately heavily, they haven't got capacity to process all of the stuff that comes out of Lyndhurst and its catchment on site. And so they basically have to open the gates straight into the Beauly River, and all of that material, so grey water, sewage, runoff from roads, microplastics, rubber, all the stuff that comes off our hard surfaces goes into the Beauly River. So where the river is now expanding into its floodplain when it rains heavily, it means that all of those pollutants are spreading across the whole of the special area of conservation, the acid grassland, which is a designated feature. And at the moment, we have absolutely no idea of what impact that's having on the biodiversity on those grassland or the ponies that feed on it. And when the flood subsides, there's often pools of floodwater that are left on the floodplain on Longwater Lawn. And it's quite common to see people's dogs jumping in and ponies drinking from it. And it's quite likely that that floodwater contains fecal bacteria and various other chemical contaminants, and no one has ever tested it yet. We're hoping to do that as part of a new PhD with Bournemouth University at the moment. But hopefully that shows this interrelationship between climate change and other stresses on the New Forest, like pollution and habitat management. If we look at impacts on mobile species, those of you that know your birds will recognise that these are cattle egrets, which are one of the new kids on the block. And if we focus initially on colonisation by southern species, cattle egret is one of a cohort of sort of charismatic megafauna birds that, particularly wetland birds like the little egret that's been around in good numbers for at least 3 decades now. And things like the spoonbill, we recently had a wintering record flock of spoonbills in the Lymington and Kiev Marshes area, which I think was nearly 40 strong, which is something that just would have been unheard of a couple of decades ago. So we've got these southern species coming in part because we've got milder winters, but in part because the hot temperatures are impacting breeding areas in places like Iberia, where wetlands are drying up. So to some extent, these are climate colonists, but to some extent, they're also climate refugees. And it's likely that things like black-winged stilt and glossy ibis are going to get commoner, and in part that may just be because they're having to evict areas that are just too dry for them now. So James Pearce Higgins and others at BTO have led a lot of the work on climate change and birds. And the comment here from James is climate change appears to be contributing to population increases and expansion of breeding water birds, including species colonizing from continental Europe, like the ones that I showed in the previous slide. So those southerly distributed water birds, coastal species, and heathland species are those most likely to benefit from climate change. So on our heathlands, the latest HOS survey, Hampshire Ornithological Society, showed that woodlarks are at a record high, and they may be benefiting from milder winters. And Dartford warblers have bounced back from the beast from the east 6 years ago, and we now have again a very healthy population of Dartford warblers on our New Forest heathlands. BBC headline. You can see the little inaccuracy there. Picture of a wasp spider, and the headline is insects. But generally, this whole thing about species migrating north, it's not just birds, but it's relevant to invertebrates as well. Wasp spider is one. However, they first got here may well have been human assisted, but nevertheless, when you look at the distribution on the left, which was up to 1991, and then the current distribution, you can see they're literally marching across southern England, and there's records, all the way up as far as Spurn now in England. This picture was in my garden, in an area of rough uncut grassland, and you see the egg sac, which the female is guarding there. And also some lawn rust fungus, which seems to do very well in wet, humid summers, like some of the ones that we've been getting. And interestingly, I now view wasp spider and its associated prey species like Roselle's bush cricket and long-winged conehead, which are also viewed as sort of climate beneficiaries, as a good indicator of good rough grassland habitat. The wasp spider needs a lot of big crunchy insects like orthopterids, and if you've got those orthopterids, it means you're not hammering the grassland through cutting it and spraying it. And so generally, if you see wasp spiders, it's a sign that you've got a good bit of rough grassland with lots of big crunchy invertebrates for them to feed on. So I think they're a good modern indicator species. Another poster child for climate change is the Jersey tiger moth, which again is one that, although it colonized southern England, obviously it's present in the Channel Islands initially, but then it colonized, and then it's taken a while, but now it's expanding north across the country at a rapid rate. And if you look at the data for the species on the excellent Hants Moths website, this goes back about it goes back to 2000, so it's 23 years of data, and you can see the big increase in records in the last few years. And when you look at the proportion of records, which probably accounts for observed changes in observer effort, you see exactly the same trend. So really significant increase across the south for that species. So as well as colonization and species coming in and starting to breed and move north across the country, we're also seeing an increase in extralimital records of moths and mobile marine species. They're two groups that I'll focus on here. And an extralimital record is where a species is recorded outside of its expected range. And although it may not be an indicator of climate change, it often fits into an overall narrative. And a couple of examples. I mean, who would have imagined if I'd been giving this talk in February 2022 and said, in the next 18 months, there'll be a walrus and a small-toothed sand tiger shark on the New Forest coast. They really would have been very hard to predict, but they both happened. Extraordinary. And there's been a paper done on these walruses that have turned up around Europe. And basically, they showed that the yearly number of records does show a significant increase. And they suggest that vagrant walruses are reaching Europe, including the New Forest, as a result of various factors, of which climatic change may be one. And then these small-toothed sand tiger sharks are a southern warm water species, but the one in the New Forest was one of 3 records in that year that were the first ones for the UK and Ireland, and again possibly indicative of a climate change-induced shift in the species range. Now in the New Forest, we're very fortunate in that we're in an area with lots and lots of moth species, and in parts that's because we're in the milder south, but also because we're near to Europe, where we get a lot of our new species colonizing from. And just to be self-indulgent for a moment, I've been mothing for 20 years or so in the New Forest and have recorded nearly 1,000 species. But until last year, I'd never got a first for Hampshire, which was something that I came very close to in 2006 with this lunar double stripe. Certainly the first one for many decades, but it wasn't the first Hampshire record, it was the second. And then in 2021, I came close again with this species, which again was the second Hampshire record. But last year I finally broke the duck and got a black V-moth on the 13th of July, which was the first for Hampshire. Like the previous two, a southern species that's coming in. There's a very small number of British records. And then literally, like buses, a couple of weeks later, I had this samphire straw Aethis bilbaniensis, which was also a first for Hampshire and the New Forest. I think it's only been about half a dozen British records. So again, these are all southern species, and these are probably the pioneers and precursors to future colonization by at least some of those species. Interestingly, for the naturalists, this one I sort of clocked as an Aethis. It was a bit different from the Micros field guide. I suspected it was bilbaniensis. I put it through OBS Identify and it said 100% bilbaniensis, which I thought was pretty impressive, in part because OBS Identify has a lot of European contributors. So that was quite reassuring. And then Tony Davis did the GenDet and confirmed that it was Aethis bilbaniensis. But I think it shows the power of some of the modern identification apps that we have available to us, as well as the excellent traditional literature. So people like Tim Sparks and others have been commenting on this, that numbers of migratory Lepidoptera are going to continue increasing, and that it may have knock-on effects for native species, and some of these may be pests for commercially important crops and trees. This is a bit different. I don't know how many of you follow target fishing on YouTube, but I thought this was interesting. Where I've been aware of gilthead bream in the Solent off the Pennington marshes and Lymington estuary for a while. But you can actually go and see a YouTube video of someone plucking gilthead bream out of the Solent just off Tanner's Lane, and this is another species that wasn't here a few years ago, and there's actually a PhD being done on it at University of Exeter, which basically modelled the distribution and said that climate change is likely to result in a further northward shift by 2050, and this will facilitate reproducing populations in the English Channel, assuming that suitable nursery areas are available. So these pioneering gilthead breams are probably going to transform into a breeding population in future years. A bit more offbeat, Portuguese man o' war. You always get headlines like this: sightings more likely amid warmer seas. It's probably a combination of warmer seas and where the North Atlantic Oscillation is and where our airflow is coming from. And when you get these late autumn and early winter, very westerly dominated airflows, very mild, then even down in Hampshire, we get Portuguese man o' war washing up. So this photo was taken at Hurst Beach in January 2020. They're normally a bit battered by the time they get to us, but you can go and find them. If you go and walk the Strand line after a series of autumn or early winter storms, you can see Portuguese man o' war even in the New Forest. Lots of changes to migration patterns in birds. So this idea of short stopping, where some of our wintering species no longer bother to come here because it's mild enough for them to stay closer to home. It's probably had an impact on the reduced numbers of things like Buick swan. Certainly there used to be a herd in the valley with white-fronted geese, isn't there now? Things like smew are extremely rare. I don't think there's been a New Forest record for many, many years. But some of those commoner species that make up the bulk of our wintering water birds like dunlin are decreasing, and things like red-breasted merganser and goldeneye are becoming increasingly scarce, particularly away from the sort of traditional core winter sites. So changes to our wintering assemblage, and one that is also a bit sad really, because it's always one of my favourite birds. Great grey shrike has always been viewed as one of those sort of iconic New Forest wintering birds. Well, we haven't had one for the last 2 winters. There's been no evidence of any that have stayed for the winter. And it's now become very rare nationally. There's only a handful nationally at the minute. There is one up near Andover at the moment, but certainly there's been no New Forest wintering great grey shrikes for the last couple of winters, and this possibly may be the start of an extinction phase, or at least a phase of it being absent. And this has been linked to both population decline in mainland Europe, where our wintering birds come from, but also potentially short stopping, where the milder winters mean they're staying closer to home. So this has all been worked on. Again, BTO have led a lot of work on this. So this idea of species staying closer to home and shifting their winter distribution is well documented. Another one that many of you will be familiar with is chiffchaff. Wintering chiffchaffs, again, a few decades ago were pretty much unheard of. Here's a picture of one at Pennington Marshes in early February in 2020. And the first report of a wintering chiffchaff in Hampshire was January 1952. And from the Hampshire Bird Atlas, it comments that small but gradually increasing numbers of regularly overwintered, around 100 in most years, are reported, but the actual population may be considerably higher. I would concur with that. I think we've probably got thousands in the county each winter now. And I went onto the Going Birding website and just took the reports for Jan 2024. And you can see counts like 92 at Eastleigh Sewage Farm that all ringed, so they're all different birds. 26 at Hampshire Hatches Lane, again associated with the sewage farm where there's lots of small flying insects. 11 at Lower Test Marshes, and last month I saw 5 myself around a muck heap on a bit of farmland near Lymington. So they're pretty common around the coast and around sewage farms where there's little microclimates with lots of insects. And again, work led by BTO and others showed that I'm not going to talk much about phenology. I'm just going to talk about it in this context of birds. But when they did a study looking at migration timing for birds over a 40-year period, they found that the arrival dates of most of those common migrant species became significantly earlier, including chiffchaff, with most species advancing their arrival by more than 10 days. So species arriving earlier in spring, and they're often leaving later in the autumn. And those that have advanced their timing of arrival often were doing best in terms of their productivity. Now, this is a busy diagram. This is work that Marcus and I did a couple of years ago. That was a resurvey of woodland songbirds in the New Forest. And it followed on from work we did in 2009, 10 and 11. But what it basically showed is that when you look at the cohort of species that are at the top there, that are mostly showing red, there are long distance summer migrants that nationally, regionally, and in the New Forest are showing alarming decreases because of a range of factors, many of which are external to the New Forest. But when you look at the chiffchaff and blackcap in the middle, they're increasing nationally, they're increasing regionally, and they're increasing here in the New Forest as well. And so these are species that apparently are benefiting from climate change. And then you look at our resident species, and interestingly, in the New Forest, most of them, apart from the woodpeckers, are stable or increasing. And I think we're seeing some evidence that the quality habitats in the New Forest are able to buffer national decreases in things like marsh tit. And we see the same thing for things like lesser spotted woodpecker and hawfinch, where our local populations are holding up in the New Forest, but they're doing pretty badly nationally and regionally. And the other comment would be firecrest. We've got over 1,000 now in the New Forest. It only bred 50, 55, 60 years ago, something like that, and big increase around the mid-90s when we saw that uplift in temperature and a cessation of hard winters. Looking at more sedentary species, brown trout has been hitting the headlines in the last few days because of this work that the Environment Agency did, which suggested that by 2080, it's unlikely to be able to persist because of the hot summers. If we look at climate change and freshwater fish in the New Forest, here's me a few years ago with slightly darker hair. And this was a sea trout in the upper reaches of the Bartley Water that had clearly just finished spawning and was spent and had died. And I got to it before the scavengers did. So you do get a run of sea trout as well as the resident brown trout in our rivers, but they're not doing very well. This is nice work done by the Environment Agency as part of long-term monitoring. And Dom Longley led this particular study. And if you just look at the box plots at the bottom, they're the catch data over the period from 2007 to 2019 for brown/sea trout. And in both the Lymington and the Bewley, they're going down. They're not doing very well. And Dom suggests that the populations in our rivers are under increasing pressure as a result of climatic trends, particularly because the New Forest has got these small rain-fed rivers that are very vulnerable to climate-related pressure compared to things like the neighbouring chalk streams that are spring-fed. And then looking at tree disease, this is a big area of concern, particularly for foresters, but also for new tree planting schemes. So this is a sycamore with sooty bark disease and coral spot that was photographed a couple of autumns ago at a site in the north of the New Forest. And there's been done by Forest Research that shows that the years following a summer in which there's been drought and mean temperature in one or more months has been above about 23, there's a relationship between sooty bark disease sitting quietly within the tree and then suddenly starting to burst out and cause problems as a pathogen. So there is a link between that disease, that fungus, and hot summers. And likewise, there's growing evidence of relationships between Neonectria and Nectria fungi affecting things like holly, particularly the well-drained, exposed holly homes in the New Forest. They're doing very badly. Probably a combination of heavy grazing pressure, so bark stripping, drought stress, and then attack by fungi such as this one. And Forestry England have been doing some work around Boldwood and other areas where they've been excluding the holly from grazing, and they find unsurprisingly that it regenerates much more vigorously. And so if you can knock out one of the links in that triangle, then we may be able to support our holly homes in persisting. Ironically, the holly understory in our beech woodlands is getting taken out to support the rare lichen communities. So when it's an understory shrub and small tree, it's doing fine, but when it's exposed in these open, well-drained holly homes, it's not doing very well at all. And then this is a collapsed beech tree a couple of springs ago. And if you look at the trunk below the fracture, you can see there's a lot of black on it, and also on the fallen branches, there's a lot of black. That's beech tar crust. And again, there's growing indications that this fungus is able to exploit weakened trees, particularly following episodes of drought. And then climate change and plant growth. This is a private site in the north of the New Forest that went from being an open, species-rich, damp meadow with lots of nice flora and inverts to becoming an impenetrable, dense growth of hemlock water dropwort with grey willow scrub. That water dropwort was about a foot higher than me. I'm about 6'2". And you just could not get through it. It was literally machete type stuff, which given this species is potentially toxic, then it's not really something that you want to be doing. So it really rendered a large area of previously species-rich meadow. Basically, you couldn't get into it, and there wasn't much life under the hemlock water dropwort. And there's some evidence that this species has spread in the last couple of decades. And if you read the account in the Plant Atlas 2020, it says that climate change may also be a factor, in part because it may be dispersing more effectively due to more frequent flooding, and in part because areas, particularly further east in its range, are probably becoming more suitable, given that it was previously restricted to the milder oceanic west of the country. The final thing to touch on is sort of vector-borne diseases. And the UK Health Security Agency are doing a lot of work on this. So this is how climate change is potentially going to impact us through disease and aeroallergens. What is an aeroallergen? Well, here's one, which I photographed last week, which is hazel catkins releasing tree pollen. And at this time of year, I always get slightly gritty eyes because of things like hazel and birch releasing their pollen. And aeroallergens can trigger hay fever and exacerbate asthma, affecting just over 10% of the UK population. And weather and climate are recognised as drivers of allergen production. And the concern is that the season for these allergies may extend, they may become earlier. But it's also likely that if we get droughts and that pollen-producing species wither and die in those droughts, then there may be less summer hay fever from species like grasses. And then if we look at vectors and vector-borne diseases, there's this rather alarming statement in the latest Health Effects of Climate Change report, which says many infectious diseases are highly climate sensitive, and with warmer temperatures, we can expect an increased risk of new and emerging infectious diseases in the UK, including those transmitted through mosquito and tick bites. And obviously in an area like the New Forest, where we're doing wetland restoration and trying to make the environment wetter, we're also making it much more suitable for things like mosquitoes that in future could be carrying all kinds of nasty diseases up from Southern Europe and North Africa. But it's affecting us now. So it used to be that ticks were one of those things that you worried about in the spring, summer and autumn. But actually, if you go out in mild weather now, you can find ticks all over the place in the forest. So basically, you have to be tick aware 24/7, 365 days a year. And that's linked to milder winters and lengthening the period in which ticks are active and biting. So what can we do about all of this? Well, at an individual level, we can think about our actions. We can take measures to try and reduce our footprint. I guess I would say to this audience, it's worth thinking about the fact that every time a car goes through the New Forest and with a combustion engine and releases fumes, then that's releasing nitrogen into the atmosphere that comes down onto our heathlands, and it's potentially changing the community of heathland flora and lichens. So, the activities that we do in our daily lives, they can have a particularly acute effect in a landscape like the New Forest that is probably going to struggle to adapt to some of these pollutants and other things in short timescales. So the New Forest National Park have their New Forest Climate and Nature Challenge pledge. So you can recycle more, you can reduce the impacts of travel, eat more plants, save energy, help wildlife, shop locally, etc., etc. What I'm doing is getting involved in trying to restore habitats and making them climate resilient as well as better for biodiversity. I'm a partner in the New Forest Species Survival Fund project, which is working across 25 sites at the moment, covering about 250 hectares. And that work is looking at doing wetland creation and restoration, woodland restoration, removal of things like rhododendron, planting of wildflower meadows, etc. But the idea is to make those habitats more biodiverse, but particularly with things like wetland creation and restoration to make them more climate resilient too. And to finish on hopefully a bit of a positive, I'm just going to show a couple of examples of this in practice at a private site in the Northern New Forest where I've been doing the ecological consultancy for the landowner for 2 or 3 years now. I've done an ecological baseline. The animal, plant and fungi list is already over 1,000. And we've transitioned from permanent pasture that was cut every year to one where we now have light to moderate seasonal grazing by cattle that come from the farm just the other side of the boundary fence. And this sort of parkland habitat is one that, when you go around and you look at the improved grasslands, which make up much of the fringe of the New Forest within the national park boundary, they're pretty poor for biodiversity, and they're not delivering much in the way of ecosystem services other than the grass or the grazing for the recreational horses that they're primarily delivering. Whereas a landscape like this is much more multifunctional. There's a bit of beef coming off it. There's some grazing that's improving the diversity of the grassland, the flora, and there's shelter. There's a few trees. It's soaking up carbon. It's providing a bit of shade, and it's making that into a much more multifunctional, much more biodiverse landscape. And one of the big wins at that site was last spring. Just within a year of changing that grazing regime, we had a pair of tree pipits that successfully nested in that parkland habitat, one of very few in the New Forest outside of the SSSI. And we also had a pair of pioneering stonechats that nested in a grass tussock, ultimately unsuccessfully, but the good news is they're looking to colonize too, because that grassland, when you walk through it now, is absolutely buzzing with invertebrates, very food rich for insectivorous ground nesting species, which is great. And then there's a pond on the site, which is only 5 years old. Wasn't particularly dug for biodiversity, but it just happens to be the right pond in the right place. This is now viewed by colleagues at the Freshwater Habitats Trust as one of the most biodiverse ponds in lowland England. It's got a fantastic range of species, 20 species of Odonata I've already recorded here, including willow emerald damselfly, small red damselfly. And the poaching of the cattle that are coming in seasonally from July to October is generating a margin that mimics those sort of ephemeral ponds on the open forest. So really good, really biodiverse pond. And one of the big wins last autumn, thanks to a tip-off from Naomi Ewald at FHT, Freshwater Habitats Trust, I was able to find pondweed leafhopper, which is New Hampshire and the New Forest, and nationally still extremely rare, but no doubt under-recorded. And it's broadleaf pondweed, which is its food plant. So when you create these ponds in the New Forest, we call it the New Forest effect. There's all these huge number of wetland species just looking to jump over the hedge or the fence and colonize. So it really helps in expanding that network, getting in these small ponds on private land around the forest fringe and making the New Forest as a whole a bit more climate resilient. So I'll finish with that positive. There are things we can do. There are things we are doing. We can all take action individually, but getting behind projects like the Species Survival Fund and working with private landowners and public landowners to increase climate resilience by making the land wetter, better connected, more vegetated, are all things that are within our power to do, and the New Forest is a great place to start it. Okay, I will finish there and stop sharing.
Thanks.
Okay, and happy to take any questions.
Okay. Can you hear me okay, Russell? Because
Yeah, all good.
right. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat already. One from Andy Barker, asking, given the toxicity of the hemlock water dropwort, how do you go about controlling it?
Yeah, really good
He's
question.
got,
So
he's got, he's got a
the
particular
site that
problem up at Hokum Mead, local
yeah.
nature reserve.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So the site that I showed was one of the Species Survival Fund sites in the Northern Forest, and it caused us a lot of headaches because, yeah, conventionally you'd use chemical control, and we didn't want to do that there because it's a wet site, it's within the New Forest, etc. And there's not a lot out there. Having searched the literature for case studies, there's not many examples other than hand pulling, which at the scale of that site wasn't going to be feasible, and I suspect it's the same with yours. So what we've done is we got a contractor in that knew, the forest and has worked with partners a lot on this sort of stuff. And they've come in and done a hard cut on it. So they've done a hard reset, opened the site right back up again, and knocked out some of the grey willows. So you can, I went to the site the other day. You can see the hemlock water dropwort coming back through. So the idea is going to be to repeat cutting, and then I think the idea is going to be to have some pathways that are open enough that they can be cut regularly by the landowners. And all of this, as well as fencing around the edging being shored up and such like, is being done with a view to getting some grazing livestock on there seasonally, which hopefully, if nothing else, they'll be able to barge their way through, relatively small bits of hemlock water dropwort. The idea was by using the cutting, we're going to try and get it under some level of control before any cattle get in there. Commoners are not that worried about having a bit of hemlock water dropwort on a site, but they're more worried about the fact that it was so herb poor that there wasn't going to be enough food for the cattle, and they'd be doing their damnedest to get out through any gaps in any fences. So we need to get the herbaceous vegetation back up to make sure there's enough food for seasonally grazed cattle, and then hopefully they will help to knock down any stands of hemlock water dropwort that do come up post cutting. But it's a knotty problem. Yeah, it's one that we've discussed quite a lot about how to deal with it, because there's not a good, set of case studies that we can draw upon.
I can just add a slight thing, Mike. Yeah, thanks, Russell. I just thought I'd ask in case there was something obvious I was missing. But yeah, Friends of Hokum Mead, we're working with Eastleigh Borough Council, whose site it is, to try and address this. We've recognised that, particularly over the last decade, has become more and more dominant. We have 3 cattle graze the site each year, but obviously they don't go anywhere near the hemlock. What we're going to try and do, or one of the things, cutting is one thing, but also we're going to try and restore some of the old drainage channels that had been there so that we can dry out some of the areas that the hemlocks managed to edge into. Because I think by having some of the bits of the site a little bit drier, I don't think it'll get in there so readily. The difficulty is there are lots of seepages, just natural seepages and springs that sort of issue into the wet grassland. That's what makes it the wet grassland. So it's a tricky balance really to deal with.
Yeah. And the site I showed where it is still open, it's become increasingly dominated by soft rush, which again is benefiting from the fact that the site's wetting up and it's holding water for a lot longer than it has done previously. So again, yeah, we've opened up a couple of drains. The areas adjacent to the drains that are now better drained, hopefully we can get in and do some reasonably regular mowing initially, just to try and get on top of the vegetation and then see whether that makes a difference to the floral diversity. But it's not easy. So imagine trying to get rid of rhododendron if you couldn't use chemical control. It's very, very difficult. Very difficult.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Interesting question from Louise, asking whether it's not a bit hypocritical to call for control of emissions when the forest is using controlled burning.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big debate nationally, this. I mean, if you follow activity on grouse moors, controlled burning is a biggie. It's a real divisive topic within UK conservation at the minute. I mean, good controlled burning undertaken by skilled practitioners only really burns the surface vegetation. It doesn't burn down into the peat. And it's the effective way of controlling vegetation load, which reduces the risk of wildfire. We've been very fortunate in the New Forest in that we haven't had any significant wildfires of the scale of something like the Wareham Forest fire of a few years ago. But we're only one, discarded cigarette away. So in part, it's keeping those areas open, and in part, it's also to do that to maintain the biodiversity, particularly things like lichens that don't compete well. And it's also in part to make sure that there's good new forage for the free roaming livestock, which, particularly in winter at this time of year, are very dependent on particularly young growth of things like gorse to sustain them through the winter. So the other option is you cut it, but without going into the details of the science, there are drawbacks of cutting versus controlled burning in terms of the carbon sequestration and the biodiversity benefits and the other benefits that you're trying to achieve. So at the minute, on balance, controlled burning is still viewed as the tool of choice in many areas, but we're very aware that it's going to come under increased scrutiny. Through the forum, we are supporting a project with Exeter University that's in partnership with Forestry England that's looking at whether some of our signature plants like heathers and things actually require smoke germination as well as heat germination. So a lot of these heathland plants will have evolved with fire as part of the landscape. We now deliver that, but in a controlled way. And if we took it away entirely, it's quite possible that some of those species would be less able to reproduce and thrive as a consequence. So it is quite a complex topic, but one that's very live at the minute. And our role through the forum and what I do is to get the evidence base upon which then those decisions can be made in an informed way.
Thanks. Dave Rumble has got an interesting point. Shouldn't Forestry England get ahead of the game a bit and replant the plantations with Southern European trees rather than potentially native trees where they need to replant, or perhaps not replant at all?
Yeah, no, really good point. So forest research is recommendation is that beech isn't really a viable species to be planting now. Things like hornbeam seemingly are much more resilient to the sort of climate that we've got and we're going to be getting soon. And it's interesting, in Southern Europe, there's evidence that things like evergreen oak, home oak are replacing beech. And those of you that know the forest will know that things like evergreen oak are doing quite well around the southern fringe of the forest. Around the Lymington area, there's plenty of it. And species like oak rustic and other Lepidoptera that rely on evergreen oak are expanding as a result as well. So it may be that we do start to see that shift just naturally, but Forestry England are certainly very conscious that their current and future planting both needs to look at the species mix to make sure that it's climate resilient, but also when they're looking at things like oak, do they take native oak or do they take strains of oak from Southern Europe that are more resilient to drought and hot weather and plant those? So I would say that forest research are doing a lot in this space, as well as looking at all those nasty pathogenic fungi. I didn't mention things like needle blight, which are massively affecting conifers at the minute and thought to have become more prevalent in sort of humid, warm summers. That's causing foresters a massive headache at the minute. So making sure that trees are both climate resilient and resilient to the new diseases that seem to be fungi that are becoming more prevalent in the current climate is absolutely a key piece of research for them.
Okay, and this is an interesting one. Mac wants to know whether you consider that if he was to widen his diet to include New Forest veal, would that have a positive or negative impact on the local biodiversity?
It's quite interesting. So you can say, well, I'll talk about venison as well. But if you got rid of beef, we are now reliant upon probably over 100 cattle just for conservation grazing purposes within the New Forest National Park across a series of sites. And I suspect the way things are going, that within a few years, we're going to have several hundred cattle that are primarily delivering conservation grazing on sites that we want to maintain as open grassland or wetland or heathland or otherwise. So we want to maintain a level of beef cattle stock within the New Forest, for example. and the hope would be they get into the local food chain, and you've got low food miles, etc. So I wouldn't want to see beef cattle disappear from the New Forest altogether. Whether the numbers that we had a few years ago under the pre-Brexit regime were appropriate for the New Forest or not is open to question. What I would suggest is that we need to eat venison at every opportunity and encourage people to eat venison, especially if it's locally sourced from the forest and surrounds. We've got big problems with non-native muntjac. We've got big problems with huge herds of fallow, particularly post-COVID. The numbers boomed and we haven't been able to get back on top of them. And that's impacting things like natural and planted regenerating woodlands and various other knock-on impacts on our flora. So yeah, if you can eat local venison, we in this household we eat a lot of local venison from the local butchers and farm shops, and we love it. And it's got low food miles, and it's hopefully providing some positive biodiversity benefit as well.
Okay, that's all the questions we've got in the chat. Whilst people are just thinking whether they've got a question themselves that they want to raise, I was just going to extend that a bit into the megafauna generally, if you like, because it would see, the New Forest by itself cannot reverse climate change. What it can do is mitigate its impact within its area, but one of the things that keeps cropping up whenever we talk about the New Forest at these meetings is the amount of, you've mentioned deer, but the amount of cattle, ponies, and so on, which are grazing the New Forest, sometimes overgrazing it. And it is that part of the mitigation that needs, or is that something that needs to be addressed as part of the mitigation, or is that a different thing that is packaged somewhere else?
Yeah, it's I think it's true to say that if you combine, I like to look at the combined livestock and deer grazing pressure in totality.
Mm-hmm.
And at the moment, today, what are we, 10th of February 2025? There could be anything between 10 and 20,000 large grazing herbivores in the New Forest National Park, but we don't actually know whether it's nearer 10,000 or 20,000, which in the year 2025, I find remarkable that we don't know how many big grazing herbivores we've got roaming around. Just don't know. You could ask 10 different people who, verderers, commoners, foresters, farmers, whatever, and you get 10 different answers. So there's huge uncertainty in exactly how many animals there are wandering around eating the vegetation and where they are and what the species mix is. I wouldn't use the word overgrazing. I'd say we're in a heavy grazing regime at the minute, but that benefits some species and it has negative impacts on others. I think, Andy's a keen butterfly enthusiast and is probably a bit sore about the levels of grazing, particularly on the open forest at the minute, because it's probably having a negative impact on things like butterflies. But we've got record numbers of woodlarks, and it will benefit things like lichens and such like on the open heath that don't compete well with other flora. And in the woodlands, the very open nature of the woodlands is probably of benefit for things like fungi and lichens as well, even though they're very flora poor in many areas. There are concerns where, we have got clearly, a cohort of old beech that's under a lot of stress and is literally falling apart at the seams. And certainly on the open forest, there's pretty limited regeneration outside of enclosures or fenced areas. So as well as that climatic stress, we are under high grazing pressure, and that's adding an additional stress for a species that, could really do with regenerating a bit at the minute if it's going to have any hope. The other thing I'd just mention with respect to Dave's earlier comment is, when it comes to planting, I think when I'm talking to landowners, I'm always an advocate of allowing natural regeneration to occur rather than planting. I think it helps build a bit more resilience into the system because you almost get self-selection of tree and plant species that can cope with the vagaries of the weather. Just look back at the last few years, we've had record wet winters, we've had droughts. Any species that are able to come through that in a naturally regenerating system are probably ones that are genetically stronger. Whereas when we plant, it's a little bit of a lottery as to where your stocks come from and how it can cope. So when you allow natural regeneration, you have to limit and manage your grazing herbivores. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So that's the joy of working on private land, is you can have things like deer control within a constrained area. and you can have seasonal, cattle grazing, for instance, where you can turn the dial up or down in terms of the duration and the number of stock that are out, and that enables you to get that natural regeneration going. And it's very motivating when you see it. It's much more challenging about how we can deliver that on the open forest, I would agree.
Okay. Just one final comment from Zoe, who's unfortunately just had to leave, but she says that in Durham they used to call burning the heather swithening, which wasn't really done for conservation reasons when she was growing up, but it was done to reduce the heather because the local sheep wouldn't eat it when it was old and woody. So they had to get rid of the old and woody heather by burning it and then let the new stuff grow through.
Yeah, and it's the same on the grouse moors. The burning is done to make sure there's nice, tasty young heather for the grouse. And in the New Forest, one of the reasons for the burning is to make sure there's young, tasty vegetation for the ponies in particular in winter.
Russell, that was a brilliant talk, and thanks for dealing with those questions, which I hope illuminated some of it as well. We will get the YouTube video done over the next 2 or 3 days, and that'll be up on our YouTube channel. I'll also sort out some of the links from Russell's presentation, which you probably wouldn't have been able to click through on from that, but I'll put some of those on our Facebook page. So you'll be able to follow some of those through from there, and I'll put a reminder of that on the YouTube channel as well once all that's done. So hopefully that'll all link together.